Hi, everyone. Welcome to Over 50 Starting Over. I'm Barry Edwards, and today we're going to be talking with Robert Ginsberg, and he is the founder of the Forever Family Foundation. And this was born out of a tragic loss of his that he will share with us, but it is giving back. It is helping us deal with grief. We are today going to talk a lot about dealing with grief. It is something that you get over 50, it starts to become a real reality. And we're also going to talk about the fun side of things, the afterlife, near-death experiences, something I've been fascinated about my entire life. And we're going to talk about mediums, the good ones and the frauds. So that comes up a little later. And we're going to touch on a little bit of reincarnation, the theories behind that. So we don't know everything. We theorize a lot. And that's, I hope you enjoy the ride. Thank you.
Ease them into it.
Yeah, we'll ease them into it. Hey, everybody, welcome to Over 50 Starting Over. I'm here with Robert Ginsberg today. Very interesting guy who he doesn't know it, but I got to know him very well over the last week. And watched the Netflix Docuseries Surviving Death for the second time. And it was really good. We're going to talk a bit about that. Bob is the founder of Forever Family Foundation. I want to talk a lot about that. I think it's a very important foundation. And he is the author of The Medium Explosion. And yeah, that's like talking to dead people. Bob also has been investigating mediumship and other evidence of life after death since 2003. Bob also conducts a certification process to evaluate mediums to see if they could do what they claim. He is also the host of Signs of Life radio show and past editor of Signs of Life magazine. Welcome to the show, Bob.
Thank you, Barry. It's my pleasure to be here with you and your audience.
I'm so happy to have you here. I want to lay the foundation. I know of the backstory, and I think I saw you on another podcast or heard you on another podcast talk about, now see, since 2003, you have done an awful lot in this space. How did you get into this space?
Got into the space as a result of personal tragedy. You know, if we go back 20 years, and you or I were discussing the possibility of life after death, I would just roll my eyes and say that's impossible. I mean, we are our bodies, we are our brains, and when our brains die, that's it. You know, we're gone forever. And I would never even entertain the possibility of life after death. And then my daughter died. She died under circumstances that were pretty strange in the fact that my wife woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning that my son and daughter were involved in a car accident, and she was trembling and ashen white. I said, what's the matter? And she said, she just looked at me. She wouldn't even talk. I said, what's the matter? And she said, something horrible is going to happen today. And I said, well, what does that mean? Can you have any details? And she said, I can't tell you, but our lives are going to be changed forever today. So I did what most parents would do. I watched over our 3 children throughout the day. My oldest one, I was going to take back to college the following day. This was on September 1st. So everybody was getting ready to go back. And then we had my middle one already was at college. So she was a week into school. And my youngest one, who was 15, Bailey, she was working one last day at a part-time job. And I dropped her off. And at the end of the day, you know, I didn't really, I can't say when Fran, my wife, mentioned it, I can't say that I really believed it, but the evidence over the, you know, we were married decades, and during that time, there were several episodes where Fran had these prophetic like visions, and every single one came true exactly the way she played it out. So I said to myself, you know, if she was right then, they were all good things, but if she was right then, she could be right now. You know, so make a long story short, at the end of the day, I let my guard down. We all went out to dinner. I let my son and my daughter drive back home. We followed them, came upon the accident. My daughter didn't survive the accident, and my son had severe brain injuries, was in a coma for a while, and eventually, you know, made a full recovery. So, you know, after it became clear, about a month or two went by, and it became clear that my son was going to survive, I was in shock for a month or two. And then I said, wait a second, how did my wife know? How did Fran know? Because she knew, she couldn't tell me exactly, but she knew. So that started me on a quest of approaching it from a scientific point of view. I met with medical doctors and researchers and scientists across the United States that studied consciousness and the mind. And because I wanted to know if our thoughts and or our minds can act independently of our physical brain. And once I saw all the evidence for that, I went further and further and further. And the rest is history. We eventually started, as you mentioned, Forever Family Foundation. In the Netflix Docuseries, didn't quite give a picture of everything that we do because it was focused on grief, and that's a big part of our work. And it was focused on mediums, but we're interested in all types of evidence, near-death experiences and deathbed visions, reincarnation, after-death communications, and so forth. So that's a long-winded answer to your question.
No, it's an important foundation. I thought for the first time as you were saying this, that this also begs the question, the situation with your wife and then losing your daughter as a result. What do you think about predestination?
Yeah, I think about that. I don't know. I haven't quite get my thoughts straight on that.
It's a tough one.
I'm an open-minded skeptic, so I remain open-minded to everything, and I just follow the evidence. I will tell you that, it was very unusual. When my daughter, as I mentioned, she was 15. What I found out later is that when she was 13, she entered into a pact with her best friend. And the pact was that if either of them were to die, they were going to make up a sign that they would communicate after their death, so the other one knew that they were still alive. Not your typical conversation.
No.
Then we also subsequently found all of her writings. She was a gifted writer even at that young age, and a lot of essays and poetry and so forth were focused around what happens after we physically die. Then when I look back about all these things, and you brought it up with predestination, I think that she had some inner knowing, because I remember one incident where we were looking at colleges with my middle daughter, and since Bailey was only 2 years behind, I figured, well, let's bring her along because it won't be long before we're going to have to look at places with her. And we're doing this college tour, and all of a sudden I look off in the distance and I see Bailey sitting alone on a bench, and she's crying, tears like rolling down her eyes. I said, Bailey, what's the matter? She said, Dad, I have so much I need to do with my life, and what if I don't get a chance to do it? And
oh my God.
And I looked at her, and not really understanding. And I said to her, of course, what most parents would say, what are you talking about? You're 13 years old, or at the time she was older. I said, your whole life is ahead of you. You're going to be able to do anything that you want. But so, maybe, I don't know whether it's actually predestined, although a lot of people in the spiritual community think so, or maybe some people are able to catch a glimpse of the future, of a future event.
I know. You made me think of that because you said you let your guard down because you're originally vigilant throughout the day about something happening. But that's what made me think of it. I don't know, but I tend to not be a big believer in predestiny just because there's so much chaos going on. It's like billiards. That one ball hits three others and causes all these different things to happen. That's a tough one, but I don't know. My mind's open to it. So I want to talk about basically everything you already touched on a little bit. I want to talk about mediums. I want to talk about more about your foundation and dealing with grief for sure. That's the main premise I think that we need to cover here on Over 50, Starting Over.
Yeah. I was thinking about that because I know the audience for your show, and I think what's interesting is that we have 12,000 members in the foundation, and very large percentage of those people are in grief. They're bereaved in some fashion, that they've lost a loved one. However, what I've been noticing over the past couple of years is that more and more people are joining the foundation, not necessarily because they lost somebody, but they're questioning their own mortality. You know, the baby boomers are starting to come of age, and you never really thought about, you're just living your life and never thought about what happens afterwards. And now people, especially after the pandemic and seeing so many people, you know, pass from it and that and everything else that's going on, people saying, wait a second, let me just look into this a little bit, you know. And the fact is that in clinical studies that have been published in peer-reviewed journals have shown this, is that people who believe that there's something more, that we're more than our physical bodies and that we continue after physical death, are able to live their lives more fully, you know, than those that don't. They also do better in the grief than those that don't. And that makes sense to me because, especially from the aspect of losing a loved one, if you believe that they still exist in some form, that could be of enormous help. And on the other, even if you haven't lost anybody, just thinking, you know, we live our lives in so much fear of dying, you know, there's so much of that, and we do everything, it's unimaginable. We do everything to prevent it. But if we believe that our consciousness or our mind or our soul, whatever you choose to call it, continues on, once we get rid of that fear, we can embrace the life that we have here in the physical.
You know, I want to say something I've said many times on this podcast throughout the last few years, is that I've read a lot of Buddhism and stuff. I don't subscribe to any particular religion. I always believed in the afterlife. I mean, big time. Open mind to it, though. But the Buddhists have a very important principle, and that is contemplate death. And that means your own death, death of your loved ones, and all of that. And, you know, as I say that, I can just feel everybody cringe around me, because everybody in the Western world is so terrified of talking about death, of thinking about it. I mean, it's our culture. As soon as it's brought up, I don't want to talk about that. You know, makes you uncomfortable. Well, that's kind of the point. When you contemplate it, for one, you do, you come to terms with the finiteness of this physical realm, but it takes the irrational edge off of the grief when death does occur with a loved one. And I mean, I've been through it, and my usual co-host and I, we talk about this. We've talked about that for years. We've been friends since college, and we've talked about that for years. I think it's a very important concept.
Yeah, and you know what also that we've seen, I've noticed it for almost since the beginning, is that there are people that we come across every day that refuse to even look at the evidence, you know, because they're in grief. And what I've noticed is that some people, they get defined by their grief. Their grief is who they are. And if I were to suggest to them the possibility that their loved one still survives in some form, they take that as an affront to their grief, as if the suggestion that their loved one still exists diminishes the depth of their grief. So they refuse to even talk about it, you know, and I understand it, but you know,
it sounds really unhealthy, man.
Yeah, I know it does, because their whole life becomes, you know, that their friends who pity them and and who, you know, pamper them, and you know, and the chances of them regaining some meaning and purpose in their life is very small, because you know, they just have become this new person that doesn't want to engage. And you know, that's not healthy, and people approach it different ways. Some people have addictions, some people start, you know, taking medication, some people just shut down, you know, I think that in some instances, you know, believing, you know, that we're more than our physical bodies can take the place of some of these people that are these medicines that people are taking to kind of,
for sure. Let's tackle that one.
Yeah.
Let's tackle that one, because I think it's an easy one, really. Are we just our brains and our physical minds? And then if that gets destroyed instantly, is everything gone? And are we nothing? You know what people like to say that sounds so clever, and I like it because it is clever, is what happens to you when you die? And and I think it's like if I say, what do you mean you believe that it's just over with? And they'll say, well, remember what life was like before you were born? And you go, no, yeah, it's just like that. Clever.
Yeah,
It's
right.
funny, it's clever. But the truth of the matter is I've been following near-death experiences my entire life in any way I could find them, books or whatever. I think it's fascinating. Almost any doctor, I think, can tell you that they've seen brains shut down for a very long time. Well, I guess you have to be in a near-death experience realm but when people come back out of it and they can explain everything, they've seen everything that went on with their body, what doctors were doing to them, describe the procedures and all of that. Apparently, they're two different things. I mean, kind of obvious, right? What do you say?
Yeah, and the evidence from near-death experiences is so compelling because, as you mentioned, these people meet every definition that medical science has for death. They have no brain waves, they have no heartbeat, they have no respiration, they have no reflexes. They are dead as far as medical science can tell. And yet what happens? They report clear and lucid thinking. And so the argument that a lot of people will make, well, it's anoxia, it's a lack of oxygen to the brain,
Right.
and these are hallucinations and so forth. But if you know anybody that was hallucinating, or even studies with fighter pilots, when they have oxygen deprivation, it's anything but clear and lucid thinking. They're
Right.
thrashing about that. It's wild. It's not an easy process to go through. So in a near-death experience, they have all these things that you can't refute. You mentioned seeing what's going on, separating from your physical body. Your consciousness goes out of your body. And you mentioned a case like that. There are cases. Kenneth Ring wrote a book about people that have been blind since birth, totally sightless. They have a near-death experience. They go outside their body and they can describe the colors and the movements of everything that went on in that operating arena and in the hospital, if they're in a hospital, and get all the colors right. So, I mean, how is that possible? The explanation is that it's possible because they're not using their physical apparatus. Their eyes are meaningless. They're seeing, sort of from a different perspective and dimension. So I think that, in a near-death experience, we read about people like going through a tunnel and moving to the light. And that happens with some, but there are about 10 or 15 different commonalities, but not every near-death experience has them all.
Right.
Some are see loved ones that have died before them. A lot of people, which might go back to your destiny, question. They a huge number say that they came back because they were told that it was not their time, and they had more things to do in their life. So the fact that it wasn't their time is interesting, because that suggests that we all have a specific time when we go, which is a hard concept,
It's a tough one.
what happens to a 1-year-old? It was their time. And, we think in physical terms, but in the spiritual terms, their soul, that this is one fragment of a soul, of a much greater soul, which is the accumulation of perhaps many different lifetimes, and we come back to that's the part about reincarnation that I never quite could fathom. Because why would you choose to come back to a life of sickness or poverty or terror? And the answer that I would always get from the spiritual community is because that was what was needed to complete this oversoul. Not an easy concept to grasp, but
no. Back to Buddhism for a minute. Since you went to reincarnation, let's visit that for a moment. So Buddhists believe that, or Hindu maybe, but believe that we're climbing a ladder and trying to reach nirvana, and so we're reborn. That's why karma. You want to create as much good karma as possible, so you're not repeating the same mistakes. And with each passing lifetime, you do climb another rung up the ladder until you hit their final destination. That's their belief. I don't know how that works. It seems to me, this is where I want to want you to chime in because you have a lot of experience with this. It seems to me that reincarnation, as far as we see, doesn't seem like everybody goes through it. The evidence isn't like that. It seems like it's much less of a percentage. Doesn't it seem like that to you?
Yeah, I think it's clear that there's a choice. Not, it's not a mandatory thing where everybody. So it's now whether that choice is ours alone or with guides or helpers on the other side that help us hash it out to decide whether we want to give it another run.
Yeah.
So I don't think that everybody reincarnates. Of course, in many countries it's more accepted and more prevalent, and that's why a lot of the reincarnation cases come from places like India and so forth.
Right.
Because there's a stigma attached to it, lots of times because of religious reasons, that people, their child may be talking about a past life, but they don't want to be ridiculed or judged by their friends or their family, so they keep it quiet.
Well, it could fly in the face of your Christianity. And
right.
So, I mean, if that happens, my God, you're going to do everything you can to bury that under the sand.
That's true. And I think, and the way that the scientists study reincarnation is they accumulate these cases. A case comes to them of a child talking about a previous life, and then the scientist becomes an investigator or a detective. They pull medical records and autopsy reports and school records and dental records and all sorts of things, and they piece together trying to see if they can corroborate some of the evidence. Sometimes, if they're lucky, the person describes exactly where they used to live, and they're able to visit their old family, and sometimes that's extraordinary. Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia spent decades accumulating thousands of these cases, and now Jim Tucker, who's also a medical doctor at the University of Virginia, continues. And I think some of his cases were in the last episode of the Netflix series.
Oh, I was going to bring that up. It's chilling. And this one, I believe he was a little boy, remembered the name of his who he was, and described his mother, knew basically the neighborhood where he was from. The doctor ends up putting pictures, giving him a choice. Is this your mom or is this your mom? And he picks his mom. Was this your house or was this your house? Picks his house. All these different things. He was 5 for 5 on every one of them, like without hesitation.
Yeah. Well, there's also a case, I think it was on the show, about the guy who remembers, Marty Martin being Marty Martin, who was an actor,
Right. It was on the show.
Yeah. And Dr. Tucker, who was describing this, had 50 pieces of specific information that were verified. Yes. So the odds against chance are pretty slim of that, of that happening.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I said, I think that this can happen. In fact, in that case, they described, I forget who described, like the mother described it as when she was about to give birth or something. I might screw this up a little bit, but she felt his soul entering her and saying, "Oh yeah, I get another chance." Something. Do you remember that?
I don't remember that.
Yeah, it's in that Netflix special. So I mean, it was wild. Let's talk about your foundation for a little bit, because I want to talk about, oh boy, I really want to talk about mediums too, though. But so I don't know let's talk about mediums for a while. Okay. And because there's practical, and then even in that special, I thought it got really kind of way out there. They lost me at some point.
Yeah, I agree with you. Absolutely. There were 2 episodes.
Yes,
they just went woo-woo and off the grid, and it didn't do it any good. On the whole, though, it raised awareness, and they got to see a little bit of both sides of that stuff. Regarding mediumship, I remember that before my daughter died, I was playing golf with a friend of mine, and my friend Kenny. Kenny had just lost his wife to cancer, and we were sitting in the car waiting to our turn to the next tee, and Kenny looks at me and he says, "Bob," his wife says, "I got to tell you, I went to see a medium." And right away, like alarm bells start going up. He says, And it was incredible. She started giving me all this evidential stuff that she couldn't possibly have known. He's going on and on. And he looks at me and he probably saw that glazed look in my eyes like people give me now, and he just said, you don't believe any of this, do you? And I gave him some lame answer. Well, Kenny, you never know. And I remember going home to my wife saying, oh my God, Kenny's flipped out. He's going to some gypsy fortune teller. She's taking him for all his money,
I think you're going to be right 90% of the time. I do still. I have an open mind. I think there are really good valid mediums out there. And I know that you know that, but I think there's a lot of fraud. It's so easy.
Yeah. Well, that's the reason that I wrote the book. As you mentioned, we've been conducting this medium certification evaluation program since 2005. And I developed the program after consulting and getting picking the brains of some scientists that study mediumship in a university setting. And what I found based upon my own statistics since 2005, that 85 to 90% of all the mediums that are out there cannot do what they claim. And that's borne out because only 10% have gained their certification all those years. Now, it is a little bit of a scary thought because, these mediums they are not mental health professionals, but in fact, they're sitting with people that are in deep grief, that are kind of on the edge, and they don't know. They're just looking to keep going, and they don't know whether the afterlife is just a fantasy or it's real.
Right.
And if they go to a medium and they get a non-evidential or a poor reading, they could walk away from that in worse shape than when they got there. On the other hand, a very powerful and evidential specific mediumship reading can have enormous benefits on one's grief. And I've witnessed it time and time and time again. And so, but I wrote the book really because it is a bit, I call it an explosion, but there's a proliferation of mediums out there that is extraordinary. Every place you look, because all the TV shows, I want to be like this and that. There are there's no licensing requirements. There's no proficiency standards. There's no ethics, questions. There's no continuing education. Tomorrow, you could go out and say you're Barry the medium, start charging people $500 for a reading and making up crap. So it is an issue, especially today in the information age. Where a medium can find out about your whole life with one click.
Yes.
So that's what we do. We weed out. Now, I'm not saying that 90% are fraudulent. Some of them are, but most of them are not. They do have some intuitive ability, but so do you and I to varying degrees. We all do. And, they have some intuitive moment, and then their friend says to them, well, you should do this for a living, become a medium. And lo and behold, they do. So it's a very serious business. And not everybody can do it. And there's also a difference between psychic information and mediumistic information. A lot of people are psychic. They could read your mind and transmit, thoughts to others and receive thoughts, but that doesn't mean that they have necessarily the ability to talk to somebody that's in the spirit world that doesn't have a body. It seems to be two distinct skill sets. And from evaluating them in our process, sometimes it's hard to distinguish between the two. It's not that reading somebody's mind is easy. That's extraordinary in and of itself. But for our purposes, we're looking for evidence of an afterlife.
Right. When you said certifying them, how do you certify them? That sounds like a legal. Did you do something legally, to create a certification?
No, it's our own certification process. It's a long process. It involves preliminary questions, an extensive 8-page application, committees that review it, an extensive interview, and then those that go forward in the process, they have to do a series of 5 different readings. Reading is what a medium does to a sitter, the person receiving the reading. And I train all of the sitters beforehand about scoring procedures and what's specific information and what's not, cold reading techniques, and all about mediumship. So these people already. That's not, I don't take people off the street. They've been gone through a training process. And then the medium does 5 different readings for 5 different sitters. And then we have 5 different scoring methods. And they have to reach the minimum guideline in each of the 5. So, you know, it's, as I mentioned, we've been doing it since 2005. That's what, 17 years. And there's only 25 mediums that have been certified. That's not a lot.
Well, you said about 85 to 90% did not get certification. So that's like out of like 500 or something, roughly.
Yeah, you know, so
terrible
yeah,
with math.
we have to evaluate 10 mediums to find one, you know, you know, and we don't have unlimited time and resources to keep doing this, although I'm trying to revamp it, you know, because what's happened is that as the foundation grew, a lot of the mediums that we certified back in the day have gone on to become famous, you know, TV shows and books. And so what happens when somebody becomes famous? They do less readings, they charge ridiculous amounts of money, and they have waiting lists that are 4 years long. That doesn't do us any good, because as a resource for the bereaved, you know, you're sitting there, you desperately want to talk to your loved one, you call a medium, and I could see you in 2025, and it'll be $500-600. You know, so I have to identify more people that have reasonable prices and are accessible. You know?
Do you remember that guy, John Edwards, that was on TV like 20 years ago?
Yeah.
Did he get outed? That's how I remember it. But I actually tried Googling that a couple hours ago in preparation for this, and I didn't really find it. I thought I remembered that he was outed for having the big room bugged where all of the audience was just hanging out before the show. And they, of course, would talk about this, you know, and so then he was fed through a little earpiece. Hey, the guy in the 4th row in the purple shirt, you know, all of that.
Yeah. That goes on, but to my knowledge, John never, you know, he's legitimate, and he, and I'm familiar with scientists that have conducted research with him under scientific controlled conditions, and he's the real deal. So no, to my knowledge, nobody ever found him engaged in any fraud.
It could have been a disgruntled audience member just projecting that, you know, that maybe.
Well, it's a common, you know, retort by people who are skeptical. They just say that about every medium, because in their mind, that's the only way that it could happen, you know.
Okay, so let's get on to some nitty gritty. I want to talk about real life, meaningful stuff for our audience, and I mean grief here. Somebody wrote a book about 5 stages of grief a long time ago.
Yeah, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Yeah.
Pardon me.
That was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross.
Thank you. Is that part of your foundation's program? Do you guide people through this?
I don't believe in the 5 stages of grief. You know, I mean, both from observation and from my own personal experiences, I find that stages, they're all mixed together. You're experiencing at the same time all stuff from, you know, it's not linear. You go from here to here, you know, it doesn't work.
Agreed.
Right. And even, you know, Dr. Kubler-Ross in her later years mentioned that it wasn't meant, you know, to be applicable to people that were, you know, grieving the loss of a loved one, and people kind of took that out of context. So, yeah, I think that anybody that's in grief, especially with, you know, when somebody dies in the family, can attest to the fact that it's not, you don't go from point A to point B. I remember after my daughter died saying, if I can only make it through the first year, I'll be okay. But, you know, and then I kept repeating that like as a mantra, just make it through, you know, got 2. And then the first year came and it was not much changed, you know. So then you say, it's okay, if I can make it through the second year. So the only thing with grief is that, what I can say is that, you know, the hole in your heart never goes away. And anybody suggests that they can cure grief is absurd, except that the advantage of believing that a loved one still exists in some form is that you can dig yourself out of when you reach those deep chasms of despair by going over, maybe it was a strong medium reading, maybe it was a book that you read, maybe it was a profound personal experience, and you can, wait a second, this happened and that happened, and you can dig out. Whereas people that refuse to acknowledge anything, they don't have that mechanism to dig out, you know. So, and I think over time also, grief just changes form, so it gets a little bit lighter, and you might wake up one day and say, wait, I went 2 hours without thinking of my loved one, and then you say, wait, I went the whole day, and then that turns into a couple of days. And so things it changes in that form.
Mm-hmm. I think that what I saw in this Netflix special on your foundation was just too fleeting. It was just not enough. So how long does a participant go there on? These are retreats that last X amount of time, correct?
Yeah, we have 4 grief retreats per year. We have 2 in Connecticut, 1 in California in October, and 1 in Florida in January. And we invite 4 mediums that have been certified by our foundation. A grief professional, a clinical psychologist, some metaphysical practitioners, and so forth. And we give presentations. The people get to sit in small breakout groups with these mediums, and it starts on Friday afternoon. It ends on Sunday night. And out of all the things that we do, and we do a lot, those are the most significant and profound to us, because even though they're small, intimate groups of 50, 55 people, we will look at people when they come in on Friday, and some of them, you could feel it, I mean, they can't even smile. They don't even want to, I'm not sure they want to be there. It's hard. And I see those same people, not everybody, but most people, when they leave on Sunday night, there's laughter and there's joking and there's hope and there's crying, and lots of times those effects are long lasting. I can't tell you how many times people have written that, we changed their life, or we hope to save their life because they didn't know how to make it through. So we try. It's not all about mediums, although mediums are an integral part of this, but I'll give a presentation about afterlife evidence, and I take it in a logical fashion, why we're more than our physical bodies, kind of backing into it, make it a little bit more palatable for people.
Yeah, well, if you can give people at that really helpless time just some hope, I mean, that means everything. It's not, expectations need to be managed. You're not going to take away someone's sadness and grief, but to give them hope. And I think that there's probably nothing that is more hopeless than not having any belief in an afterlife whatsoever, or a God, a higher power. It just leaves you with complete nihilism. I mean, you just have to assume that life has no meaning whatsoever, other than to come to a horrifying end at some point.
Yeah, and for some people, blind faith, also fostered by formalized religion, is enough for them, and that's great.
Agreed.
When people, sometimes I'll start a retreat and I'll say, how many people believe in an afterlife? And most people will raise their hand. But what a large percentage of people really mean is that they hope there's an afterlife.
Yeah.
I haven't really seen any evidence for it, so they haven't had any profound experience that tells them, so I think sometimes there's a progression. People go from hope to belief. And then if they're really lucky, they go from belief to a knowing. And once they reach that knowing stage, kind of flips their whole perspective on life.
Yeah, agreed. How about the near-death experience? There's a lot of people that talk about, going into the light, and after you do that, maybe you are greeted by loved ones. That's usually the case. Then you get a viewing of what happened throughout your life, and it's without judgment. It's just, right. Yeah. What do you suppose that's about? Are you supposed to be your own judge on?
Yeah, two take-homes from those life reviews. First of all, just as you described, they described their whole life like a movie reel, just flipping by, and they get to feel all of the good and the love and the warmth that they projected onto others, and it makes them feel good. But conversely, they also feel the hardship or the meanness they cause to others, and it doesn't feel so good. But the take-home from all this is that there is no judge or tribunal that you sit before and they say you go here and you go there. It is, as you mentioned, all self-judgment. And we tend to, the consensus of opinion is that we tend to congregate with people of like mind, maybe you want to call it like mind or the same vibration or frequency. So we determine, where we should be. Now, there very well may be a progression in these other worlds where we continue to evolve. And I would imagine that there's help. One thing a lot of people ask is, well, where do people like Hitler go?
Right.
So, I imagine that Hitler went with people of like character, of like mind. But I think that, that was maybe one piece of a greater soul. And with help, he sort of gets rehabilitated, to keep moving higher. So
okay, I got to drill down on that more. You have so much experience in the research that you've done here. So, all right, so I'm going to be blunt. Are those near-death experiences, is that heaven, do you think? And do you believe in hell? You're talking about Hitler. I'm getting right down to the nitty-gritty. Do you believe in hell? Is that heaven?
I don't personally believe in hell. I think that because of self-judgment, we can find ourselves in uncomfortable situations and places because of what we've done, in this physical world. But remember, these near-death experiences come back, and they have to put these ineffable experiences into words, and they can't. So the best, and it's also, when they try to translate it into words, it's based upon their own conditioning, their own
limitations,
vision, their own inclinations, the social norms. So to them, they were taught that a nice place must be heaven, so they describe it as heaven. Some people have a near-death experience here, and they describe, for example, seeing Jesus. Somebody might have a near-death experience in another country and describe seeing Muhammad, or Buddha.
Right.
So they're seeing the same entity, but they're describing it different. So it's but also what a lot of these experiences talk about is that there's not religion per se, in the next world. It's all spirituality. It's all, we come from the same spark of light. It's all, we're entities of thought, it's so we communicate that way. So there's no need for crime. I mean, everybody knows your thoughts, so you're kind of forced into,
I'm in complete agreement with you. And I tend to believe different things in different days, but in a way, I believe that this physical plane that we're in is kind of like the Big Bang, and everything was one. And then everything got blown apart into this linear thing. And then we're trying to come back to that one. And you could call that God or heaven or whatever. So I agree with you in that regard. And I also, for that reason, I don't really believe in hell. It doesn't make much sense to me. Oh boy, it was
my theory on the whole thing differs from most, and I get criticized by a lot of people for this, because how people that are very spiritual always say there are no such things as coincidences. Everything is for a reason.
Say that a lot.
Yeah. My wife used to say that too. I don't, and I've gone over this in my head thousands and thousands of times. Here's what I believe. I believe that, yes, there are coincidences. I mean, not everything is a sign from your loved one. Not everything was meant to be. Happenstance and happens. I believe that our entire physical existence is chaotic and random. But that's by design. Okay, so it sounds like a contradiction in terms, but I understand. It's organized chaos, because we're meant to have all of this crap thrown at us, all these obstacles, and they just happen because they happen. If you believe in a designer, okay, here, you're on your own. I'm not interfering. Make of it what you will. You know what you're supposed to do. And so I think that how we respond to all of these obstacles, how we live our lives, with meaning and purpose, affects us when this physical life is over. Then the chaos and the randomness forms patterns, and we get to see the patterns. We can't recognize the patterns while we're here. So,
That's interesting.
I read a book once by the world's greatest shamans, and that always stuck with me. The shaman wrote, he says, this physical life is like being at a football game. He said, when you sit ground level, the best seats in the house, and you could hear all the grunts and the screams and the crunches, and it's really chaotic with people running back and forth and so forth. But when you move up to the very, very top row in the stadium, you get to see all the formations and the patterns. He said that's what physical life, we can't recognize it while we're in the midst of it. But when we have a greater perspective, when that time comes, and for some people are able to do that while they're in the physical, then you start to see all the meaning.
Oh, that's a really good analogy. That's a really good analogy. And that also we could take that and maybe surmise that there's a step beyond that as well. And maybe or this graduation that we do upon dying is just one of many levels that we climb to. Just because we don't know what goes on after death per se doesn't mean that there's not a whole greater thing behind that as well. Maybe we go on, and maybe we have multiple levels.
Yeah. And the other thing that's interesting is that, I know years ago, after my daughter died, I started reading. I mean, I read hundreds upon hundreds of books, and my head was exploding. And one of the first books that I read was the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And there were parts in that book that I found disturbing to me, because, in a lot of the Eastern philosophy, we merge into the greater awareness. So we meld, and so in that, I found that disturbing to me, because then that means that we don't retain our memories anymore and our personalities. But then when I started to study all this stuff, the opposite seems to be true. At least for a great while, we retain most of our memories and our personalities. So we're individuals in part, yes, we are part of this vast greater universe, but we retain our individuality, and that, from the perspective of losing someone, to me, that's comforting, because that means I can still communicate with that person.
Agreed. Interesting, because I've been struggling with that too, because our near-death experiences, the stuff that we could draw from that, is such a short period of time. So I've struggled with, well, maybe that's just the entrance to the Grand Hotel. And we just, but maybe your energy dissipates and you climb up into this, whatever that is. So I find something of a comfort in what you're saying as well, that you retain some individuality. That's very interesting.
Yeah, and scientists would describe it one way, and spiritualists describe it another. But it comes back to frequency and vibration. So each level that we go to has a higher and higher, frequency. And when you reach a frequency that's very high, it's very, very difficult to communicate back with this dense existence, although it's possible, it's not easy. So I think that there may come a time when, well, maybe it's just not important anymore. The people there, they'll see you again. They know that, and they've already given you evidence that it still exists. So they're moving on, doing other things,
Yeah.
So it could be that enters into the equation too.
Sure. Hey, let's I don't know how much time you have, but I want to get into some fun stuff. And I want to talk more about the mediums, where they called it in the show, said that there's mental mediums versus the physical mediums.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the physical stuff.
All right. So 99% of the mediums that you see today are called mental mediums.
Agreed.
They're communicating telepathically. Just as I communicate with you, mind to mind, what the mediums are doing is still a telepathic process. It's just that one of the parties doesn't have a body, but they still have a mind. So, mediums are communicating telepathically. Now, And there's trance mediums, which you hardly see anymore, mostly in yesteryear, where they would actually go into a trance and the person in spirit, the discarnate entity, takes over their body.
Oh, right.
Then there's full trance or semi-trance and so forth. What you saw is then they talk about physical mediumship.
Yeah.
It's a whole different can of worms. Now,
yeah, it is.
There are physical mediums in the world today, but very few. But it was very, very prevalent in the Victorian era, and some of them were studied by Nobel Prize, winners, medical doctors, and really top people, and they found that some of these mediums were, of course, total frauds, and others they could not find any fraud whatsoever, and they walked away believing that it was taking place. So in physical mediumship, same thing. The person in spirit takes over the medium takes over the body of the medium, starts talking through the medium's vocal cords, and associated with that, all this physical phenomena takes place: levitations, lights, wrappings, ectoplasm that exudes from.
I can't wait to go there.
From the orifice of the many orifices of the medium.
Yes.
So. Because it's connected with our work, I studied it, I researched it, I read a lot of books about it. And like I said to my wife, you know what? I can't talk intelligently about it without experience it. So there was a physical medium from Germany that was doing a demonstration for people that we knew in the United States. It just so happens he was out in Reno, Nevada, and we were living in New York at the time, so that wasn't too convenient. But we got invited to sit in a seance. So,
how cool!
So we went. Now, the first rule about physical mediumship is that the mediums insist that the process has to take place in total darkness.
I know, and that's where they lost me immediately. It's like, now, of course, right.
And that's where, if there is fraud, that's where it's going to take place. Now,
that's right.
The explanation that they give is that this substance that they use during the process, this ectoplasm, gets affected by light. And it changes the structure of it. And then when it gets reabsorbed into the body of the medium could get deathly sick or die from it. Okay.
Oh my God.
However, in my readings, I know that there was some great physical mediums in history that did this stuff under, pure daylight, which raises the question of how come they never got sick, and so that's another thing. So now I went out there. I was not there as a researcher. I was just there as a regular person that was sitting in the seance. I didn't have any access to examine the room. The medium sits in a cabinet, which is essentially like this little alcove, and I couldn't examine that. I couldn't examine the medium's hands. So, the medium had two controls that would hold his hand. One person who was hosting the seance would sit and hold to the medium's left hand, and the other control would sit on the right side of the medium, except that control happened to be the medium's wife. So I was a little suspect with that. So, during the seance, and you got to hold hands, and it's hot, and it's
yuck.
You know how physically hard it is to hold your hands outstretched for like an hour. It's like it starts to fall. So, and I'm getting wrapped. They have this thing, they call it a trumpet. It's like a cylinder, and they put some reflective tape on the outside of it, because in some rare instances, they allow some very, very dim red light, so you could see something floating. Well, during the seance, I got wrapped in the head and the face and the shoulders, and I'm not talking about little taps. I'm like, wraps. So now I'm saying to myself, okay, as an objective observer, it's either this is a crock of shit, or this is something amazing. And it's so frustrating because I'm in total darkness. I could not make any type of rational judgment.
Yeah.
Although at one time they finally were taking a break and they said we can relax our hands, and I spread my hands out and I bump into the guy next to me, and the guy next to me, who's still in total darkness, goes, "Thank you, Spirit." I said, "Listen, guy, I'm sorry, but that was me. It wasn't Spirit." He was like crushed, people are also many times in a very suggestive state during these things. So,
oh yeah.
So yeah, I saw all these things. all the physical phenomena. But after it was over, I walked away with having no questions answered because,
Yeah.
there are techniques that I've read about where they have like an extender pole,
Yeah.
and they go and they're wrapping people, with that, and
Yeah.
the floating lights that got a hidden laser, So
Yeah.
I take that all with a grain of salt. Having said that, I know that there were, and there's still one or two mediums out there in the world today that can do it. And 150 years ago, they were doing it, regularly. So,
Well,
like I
wait, I
said,
want to
I'm
speak to
open-minded.
that. I
Yeah,
remember listening to a podcast a couple of years ago. It was about the Salem witch burnings, all of that stuff.
yeah,
There were two sisters. They were very young at the time, way back in the thick of that claimed to be something like mediums that could contact the witches and stuff, and they would hold their own private seances for crowds and things like that. And they did this for years.
yeah,
And it was, I might screw it up a little bit, but it was something like on the last sister's deathbed, she told all of the secrets on how they faked all of that for all of those years,
yeah.
moving
That,
their feet under the table in certain ways. And I mean, it's clever, a ball on a string going across the floor, all kinds of crazy stuff. I don't believe any of that. Oh, here's another thing I got to ask you about ectoplasm. Has there ever been any physical evidence of ectoplasm, or is it just the hearsay that happens in pitch blackness?
well, it's been photographed,
Yeah.
and examined. But well, all right. Well, it has been actually captured, a specimen, and examined in a laboratory, and
Okay. Now we're getting somewhere.
and there were a lot of inert, different, materials within the ectoplasm. Some easily identified, some not. So it still raised more questions than not.
Mm.
The medium in question that I was talking about, I won't mention his name, but he was researched by a top researcher in the field. And this researcher wrote a paper in a peer-reviewed journal exposing fraud. He caught the medium in the medium's bag, that stuff that you buy in, for Halloween in those stores that you spray. It looks like spider webs,
Oh, silly
whatever, silly string,
string,
that kind of
silly
stuff.
string.
He had a container
Oh
of that in
my
his way.
God.
And
See?
he also had a laser device, like in
Oh,
there. So he actually nailed them, on fraud. Now,
mm.
some of these mediums, like you were talking about the Fox sisters, and
Oh.
they were known, thought of to be the forerunners of the spiritualist, movement. Um,
How
and
bad did I screw up that story?
no, it was pretty accurate.
Oh,
So
okay.
one of the sisters, who, had a problem with alcohol and so forth in the later years, um, supposedly admitted to all the fraud. The other sister didn't, but it was questionable, because she was offered money. They wanted to write a story. Was she
Mm.
just saying it to get the money? We don't know the true answers to that. Some of the phenomena, I believe, was real. They used to do these rappings. So they
Yeah.
would ask, they'd have like a Ouija board or a table, and
Yeah.
they'd ask to rap, or they say, rap once for yes and two for no, and then he used to spell out things. So make of it, you can make of it what you will, but as I mentioned, some of the mediums back then, they were examined under brutal conditions. I mean,
Mm.
they were gagged, they were, hogtied, they were really put under physical duress, and yet these phenomena would occur. And it couldn't possibly have been the medium, or there was no, accomplice in the room. So,
Oh, but Bob, but today we still don't have real video evidence. I mean, an infrared camera, it's like, hey, every week this guy holds a seance and check out this stuff.
yeah,
We don't have that. So
no,
I'm not buying it. I want to ask you about this, and you probably don't want to say anything bad, but it was maybe one or two. The Netflix docuseries was 5 or 6 episodes.
six.
6. It was a couple after yours. It got a little silly after that. So we go off to, I think, Holland in the Netherlands, and we visit the woman with the short blonde hair who she's a do you want to say physical medium? I'd say a trance medium
Yeah.
based on your earlier description. And she would do these seances and then all of a sudden talk in this creepy, deep voice. And then she would turn into Tommy, who's a little boy.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I gotta tell you, that was the silliest stuff I ever saw.
Yeah, they lost me on that too, Barry.
Okay. I didn't think you'd admit it. It was so I think I was watching this woman talk and I'm like, I know she's a fraud, but I bet you she half believes her own crap. I bet she does.
Yeah.
So,
it's that kind of stuff. I mean, it served a purpose because the viewers got to see, good and bad.
I guess you're right about that.
It's not all one way or the other. And also, what I've noticed over the years, after working with all these mediums, is that we put even our really good mediums, we put them in the role of being a performer because we have them standing up in front of groups or sometimes large groups, and they feel the need to perform, whereas instead of, honing in. So like if the medium is stumbling and needing more information, they got to quiet their minds and ask for more. But then, you don't want to be on stage and have silence for a minute. So what happens is they start to interject what I call filler, which is their own conscious observations, which have no place in mediumship, and that's where they get into trouble. And we foster that by putting them in that role. Incidentally, I have a tremendous problem with these mediums that play audiences of thousands of people. To me, that's absurd. They charge $150 a pop or whatever it is to get in. 5,000 people. 5,000 people driving there thinking that the bond that they had with their loved one was so great that somehow their loved one's going to come through. And then the medium does 6 readings. Do the math. 6 readings with 5,000 people. What are your chances of getting a reading? Like 0.000. So I got a problem with that.
I did write down the name of the medium that was close to your special. It was back during those specials in the Netflix docuseries that I thought were super valid and really good. Her name was Laura Lynn Jackson. Yeah. I think she's 100% legit.
She is extraordinary. I've watched her work over the years. We certified her back in 2005. She wrote her first book based upon, group events that she did for our foundation. She's also participated in research. She's going to be at our retreat in January in Florida. But she's gone on to become wildly, popular, wrote a lot of books, but to her credit, she's remained grounded and volunteers her time to the foundations. I appreciate it. But yes, she's the real deal, and she's on a really high level of, I consider her to be among the very best mediums in the world.
Yeah, well, she's super grounded, like you said. She'll look you right in the eye and you can see the compassion and that she surrounds herself with. With that, Bob, how about where can we find you? Like, if people, I'm sure there'd be people interested in where they can find out more about the Forever Family Foundation. Go ahead.
Yeah, the website is all spelled out, foreverfamilyfoundation.org. And, you'll see tabs on a lot of the things that we've been talking about today. The book is called The Medium Explosion. People can get that on Amazon. I write a personal blog called beyondthefivesenses.com. That's just an outlet for me to get my thoughts out there before my head explodes, So
spell out 5 or no? Numeral.
Yeah, everything's spelled out, beyondthefivesenses.com.
Okay. I didn't have that link. Yeah. Okay. I will put all these links in the show notes, by the way.
Yeah, we also have aired a live radio show every Thursday since 2005. And all the shows are archived on our site. So if you see somebody on TV or you read a book, whether it's a scientist or a researcher or whatever, a medium, do a search in the archives, because chances are I've interviewed them over the years, and then you could have an hour interview with them to listen.
Well, I might take a look at that, see if I can find a good future guest. I mean, that'd be interesting.
Yeah, you could do that. Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, Bob. With that, we'll wrap up for now. If you ever want to come back again, I could talk about this stuff forever.
Yeah, it was my pleasure, Barry. Good being with you.
All right. Take care and have a great weekend. All right,
Thank
bye-bye.
you. You too. Bye.